So it's lesson 11 of COMP2068. It's our second of 3 classes working with AngularJS. We're working with version 1 of AngularJS. So before we start building we're going to actually build a new application today with Angular. We talked last week and we saw a little bit about what Angular does. Why are we using it at all? Like, what's the purpose? I mean, we can build out for your assignment. We're not using Angular. We're using EJS templating. We're using Node and Express in the back end and MongoDB for our data. So we don't really need Angular, but it offers some features and functionality that we don't have. Why use it?
Allows you to make like single page website.
Okay. Can you explain a bit more how it does that? You're right, Sakura.
You don't have to refresh the page in order for stuff on the page to update, like for example on arts.
Okay, and why is that beneficial? Why don't we just refresh the page?
Because if you're really looking to refresh the page a lot, then users get angry.
Okay. Yeah, it's a bigger load on the server. It uses bandwidth, increased hosting cost, and it's a slower experience for the end user, right? If they only need to refresh 5% of the page, Angular allows us to leave the rest of the HTML static and just update the things on the page that they need. So these are all some really good reasons to use it. So what we're going to do this week, here's what we did yesterday in class. So on the Thursday class, we've been building all semester a video games tracker, and on our Friday class, we've been building a liquor store. So we did a single page version in Angular and HTML. So we could add games, view, and delete all in a single page. Notice we don't get a full page refresh. So the page only has to be loaded once, and the only content that changes is our input box and a few values. So this is what we want to do today. We're going to build out a new version of our drink store that's a single page application. Okay, so we'll build one page and we'll be able to do 3 of the 4 CRUD operations. We'll leave out update, but we'll be able to add, view, and delete today. Now, this page is not tied to our MongoDB. We're going to kind of do this in 2 parts. So today is an HTML and Angular version only. So this list of data, this is just stored as an array in memory in Angular. As soon as I refresh my page, I've stopped this. As soon as I refresh it, the data goes away. So I'll always get a blank page when I reload. But as long as that page is open, I can add, remove. Okay. So that's what we're going to do this week, so we can kind of get an idea of how it works. And what we're going to do next week is we're going to build out an Angular front end into our existing Node and Express application. So we'll build the full stack application next week, working with our MongoDB. So what we're going to do is, I think, to start class next week to save time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use, well, basically I'll use my lesson. What's the last version of the drink store we did? I think probably lesson 9 before we started Angular. So what I'm going to do is copy that. I'll put it up on GitHub, and I'll ask everyone to download that same starter template, or else use your own lesson 9. So we'll work from that existing template, and we'll remove the EJS front end, and we'll build a front end with HTML and Angular instead. So by the end of class next week, we'll have a full mean stack application that does create, read, update, and delete. So we have a lot to do next week. We're going to go fairly fast. So there isn't going to be a quiz. We'll start right at 8 o'clock and get going on it. So we could try and get the whole application built in 3 hours. Should be possible to do. So we're just going to look at my lesson 10 folder for a minute and decide whether we want to copy that or we'll just start fresh. What do we have here? So in JavaScript, okay, we've got Angular, so we're going to need that. And style sheets, we're going to need that. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'll just make a copy of my lesson 10 folder, and then we'll get rid of the stuff we don't need. We basically just want Angular and Bootstrap, pretty much. So I'll paste this as lesson 11. You can grab my lesson 10 repository off GitHub if you prefer. We're pretty much starting from scratch. I'm going to get rid of everything other than the external files we downloaded last week into the project. So I'll open up my lesson 11 solution. Close my files up. So I'm going to get rid of my 2 HTML pages, which I'm not sure if I can remove. Oh yeah, I can delete them from here. So I'm just going to keep my style sheets. And I'm going to get rid of calculator and scripts. We don't need those. So all we have is a bunch of third-party libraries here. Angular, jQuery, jQuery validate, which I don't think we're going to use today, and the Bootstrap CSS. We have our own custom style sheet. We don't really need this either. We'll just work with Bootstrap. I'll get rid of that as well. Doesn't matter if it's there. So we basically have an empty project that's set, but it's set up to be able to use Angular, jQuery, and Bootstrap. So we're going to build this as a single page application, also known as an SPA. So all we actually need in here is one HTML file, and then we'll write our own custom JavaScript that uses Angular to keep track of our current list of drinks, where we can add and view and remove from that list. So in my root folder, I'll just create a new HTML file, and you can just call it drinks.
I don't know if, like, whenever I make a, like, I use Atom, so I type HTML versus enter, no, I make HTML. When I do that, it automatically adds in Bootstrap, but it gets some external location. Is that, like, is it better to download the files, or is it better to, like, what's your opinion on that?
Good question. We actually talked about this last week. There are some reasons why we downloaded them. What are some of the benefits of having local copies of those files rather than using the content delivery networks, the CDNs? It works with the CDNs.
Is it possible for the CDN to, like, be down for some reason?
Well, that's one issue. If for some reason the CDN is offline, okay, which is less of a problem with our CSS, more of a problem with our JavaScript files, right? If we're depending jQuery and for some reason we can't access the jQuery over the CDN, things are going to break on our application. That's one issue with the CDN. Why else? What are some of the other issues with using the CDN versus downloading these files locally? Prashant?
When we write down the class, it will, all the classes that we have.
Yeah, that's one of the bigger ones. In our code editor, when you use the CDNs, your code editor doesn't read the file, so you don't get the code prompts. It doesn't recognize the classes or the objects in those files. When you download them locally, if I put in an HTML element and type class equals, if I've got local references to Bootstrap, it'll pop up the names of the classes in the CSS. When you use the CDN, you typically don't get those because it doesn't read over the internet. But when it's local, most of your code editors will be able to do that. It's also, which is going to be faster, reading those scripts and CSS definitions over the internet or locally. Right, it's going to be much faster to read it locally. So in general, you know, as we're developing, using the CDNs is easier. It saves us from having to download everything and create the links. You can just copy and paste the links from the third-party site. But in production, yeah, we're probably better off to get those things locally. So it doesn't really matter what you call this file. You can call it index, you can call it lesson 11, doesn't matter. I'll just put in a hard code in my title here. This is our drinks, our single page application using Angular 1. And now we'll want to include a few of these things. Actually, just to make it simple, we're not actually going to even use jQuery today, but actually, I guess our Bootstrap JavaScript uses it, so we'll keep it. So let's put in our 2 Bootstrap CSS links. We'll put in the minified Bootstrap first, and then the minified Bootstrap theme second. And we need to put them in that order because the theme depends on Bootstrap, on the Bootstrap core file. And WebStorm, as soon as I start typing and I find the element I want, I can just hit the enter key and it auto completes. We're just going to add Angular. We don't even really need jQuery for today. So I'll add a script tag down the end of my body. So now our page is set up to use Bootstrap and Angular. Cool. We could launch it in our browser. We're just going to get a blank page with a title. There's nothing on here at the moment. So I'll just kick it off. Blank page. Just to make sure my references are good, if I view the source, I can click on each link. Few students yesterday either weren't getting style sheets or weren't getting Angular, they were getting errors. For example, I had a student who put in here the path, it said JavaScript, singular. So nothing was running. So the easy way, if once you view the source, if you click on each link, it should load the file. If you get a 404, well, there's a problem with your link. So that's an easy way to debug your JavaScript and CSS. Make sure that all of your paths are correct. So I just viewed the source and I verified that each of those links is working. So what I want to do now is I want to set up about 95% of the HTML we're going to need to add, view, and delete. We'll apply a bit of Bootstrap for formatting if we want to. And then we'll start connecting our HTML up to Angular, and then we'll write our Angular script. Now, a student in yesterday's class had a good question. He said, do we have to do it that way? Could we write all the Angular code first and then build the interface? The answer is yes, you could do it that way. There's nothing wrong with that. My typical workflow is I kind of do the presentation and the non-thinking. For me, the HTML part is generally the non-thinking stuff. I don't have to figure out how it works. I'm just basically slapping on the tags and checking in the browser that things look right. So that's my preferred method. Do we have to do it that way? No. We could start by writing our code and our logic first if we wanted to. Usually that's the hard stuff. I leave that for the end once my application's all set up. So I'm going to put on a main section. Scott's been posting a lot on Facebook lately about how we should try to avoid using div tags wherever we can because they're not descriptive. So I'll try and take his advice. He's the HTML guy, knows a lot more about it than me. So we'll put on a main, and we'll give it a class of container, which will just give it a little padding with Bootstrap. And in here, I'll put in an H1. This will be our Angular drinks list. So then we want two sections of our page. The first section at the top is for adding a new drink, and the section at the bottom will show the list of current drinks. So we can use two section tags. So that'll be our first section. That'll be our second section. And in this one, I'll give it a class of Jumbotron, which will give it a gray background with rounded corners around it. So we have an H1, which is a heading for the whole page. I'll put H2 tags inside of each section. So a subheading. So inside of our first section, the heading will say add a new drink. Down here, we'll have a our second section will have a different subheading. It'll say current drinks. So I'll just go back and refresh my browser, make sure it looks okay so far. And then we'll need to flesh out a simple form in here and a simple list in here. Okay, so that looks okay. So you got the Jumbotron giving it this background, and we're just going to put a simple form here with a label, a text box, and a button. We won't really see much down here for a little while, because until we can add a drink, there isn't going to be anything to show in our list. Unless our other option is we could populate an initial list of drinks when the page loads. We could set up a simple array. Maybe we'll do that. So when our page loads, we'll automatically have kind of a default list. The other sections we've initialized it as empty. We'll maybe initialize our list with a few values today. Everybody with me so far? Everybody okay? All right, so let's add a form in here. Right? We need an input with a text box and a button. That's got to be contained inside an HTML form. So let's add a form tag. Now, when we added forms in our Express application, well, let's think about forms we've built both in PHP as well as in our EJS templates. When we built PHP forms, we usually added a couple of attributes to the form tags. What attributes did we add? Yeah, usually the method is post, and what was the other attribute we typically added? No? Wolfgar? Yeah, we typically added the action. So what page would receive the form submission and process the values? When we've been working in EJS, we've been adding the method, but we've been omitting the action. So what page do our EJS forms post to? Yeah, they post to themselves. With no action, they reload themselves. With our Angular forms, we're going to do something different. We don't want to specify either a method or an action. We don't want an action because if we have an action, it's going to take our user to a different page. Remember, this is a single page application. There are no other pages. We don't even want a method. The reason why is if we specify a method, our entire page is going to submit to the server and reload. We don't want that to happen. We want our form to get processed by Angular instead. And remember, Angular is front-end code. So we're going to use Angular to interrupt the normal form submission. So we don't actually declare a method on our form. What we're going to use instead, and we'll do this in a bit, is we're going to put an Angular directive on our form tag. So Angular, so the form will submit to Angular instead of submitting to the server. So we'll leave out all the Angular directives. We'll just add the HTML presentation layer only first, make sure it looks okay. And then the second step is we'll start adding in the Angular directives in certain spots. So inside our form, we'll put on a label. And we'll create a text box. We'll give it a name and ID. And we'll put on a button. So we'll have a text box and we'll have a green button beside it. Should look like this. Oops. Something's wrong with my button class. Because BTN submit doesn't exist, the class name is BTN success. So again, Sakura, I'm just coming back to your question about the CDN. Without having Bootstrap locally, I'm probably not going to get that prompt in my code editor. I'm not sure. What I'd have to do is remove all the CSS from my folder, add the link to the CDN, and then I could try it and see what happens. I have a feeling that code prompt isn't going to come up if I do that. Sorry? I'll maybe give it a try in a minute.
Yeah. It comes up like I'm using Node. You just go like BTN.
We're using different editors.
What editor are you using, Megan?
We're both using Atom.
So in Atom, when you use the CDN, you still get the prompt for the class?
Yeah. Well, I think it's Bootstrap is kind of, we actually have a plugin for Bootstrap, so it recognizes it.
Okay. Well, you know what? If I remove this, I'll just cut this for a minute and put it somewhere else. I'll just take it right out of my project. So now I don't have it. Okay, so I have no CSS. I'll go get the CDN link and try that. We'll see what happens if I get my code prompts. So if I just use the CDN instead, so I'll comment those out. I'll put in my CDN. My CSS should be working again. But now the question is, do I get the code hinting? Right? So if I want to attach a class here, I get nothing. At least in WebStorm, it doesn't read those classes over the internet. So it works, my CDS is fine, but I've made my development job life a little more difficult by doing it this way. I don't get, and it would be the same with Angular hints. So for example, what's one of the Angular directives we used last week? So when I type, oh, well, sorry, I get it because Angular's here, but it's probably going to be the same. If I use the Angular CDN, I'm probably not going to get the Angular directives coming up either, right? I'm getting them because my file's local. So my code editor is reading the class names out of the AngularJS. Go and move that back in. Make sure I've still got Bootstrap. Whoop. No. I undid it. It's back. It's fine now. So by downloading the files and making my reference locally, my editor gives me the code hinting. It doesn't do it over. Now, maybe some editors will. Maybe this is just a feature of WebStorm, but I don't think so. I know Visual Studio, it's the same thing. It will read those files if they're local in your project. Okay, so this is set up. It won't do anything yet, right? If I try adding a drink right now, it runs a GET request because we haven't specified a method, and it reloads the same page. Once we wire up our form to submit to Angular, we won't get this, and the page won't flicker because it isn't going to submit the whole page to the server. The other thing we want down here is we need an unordered list. And we'll give it a class, list group. And in here, we'll have list items that have a class of list group item. So every drink is going to show, we're going to need some kind of looping structure to generate a pair of LI tags for every drink in the list. We have 5 drinks, we have 5 sets of LI tags. So if I save this, we really won't see anything yet because our list is empty right now. So, well, we see the border around the list, but nothing. There's just an empty LI. That LI list group item has that border. So we've hard-coded one in, but there's no value in it right now. So we'll come back. First, we need to be able to add drinks. Well, actually, if we initialize a list of drinks, then as soon as we load the page, that is going to show up once we also add our looping code here. So we haven't written anything, any Angular, any code yet. We've basically just got things set up. So this is pretty much all the HTML we're going to need. The only other HTML element we're going to add is eventually we want to add a red delete button or remove button inside of those list items. So after we print the name of the drink, every drink will have a delete button beside it. So we'll add that part in. That'll kind of be the last thing we're going to do. We'll add that. But almost all the HTML we need is here. So our next step is going to be to start writing some Angular directives and creating an Angular, a JS file that uses Angular that can create a list of drinks, and we'll want to bind that list of drinks here. And then we're also going to need to write a function for adding a drink and bind the value from our text box so that we can take that text box value and process it with Angular. Much like we did last week in class with our little calculator, right? We had X, we had Y, we had a drop down, and we added Angular directives to those inputs. So then we wrote our Angular calculator file that could process those inputs. So we'll be doing something similar today. Does anybody have any questions about our application so far? Okay, I'm going to stop the video stream then. Let's take about a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 9:05 and we'll start wiring up our form to use Angular.